For more on this story, I'm joined by Martijn Boersma from the University of Technology, Sydney Business School. Martijn, thanks for coming in. Now, do you believe these companies are deliberately underpaying staff, or they're just not committed enough to get it right?
I wouldn't necessarily call it deliberate. I think the excuse we often hear is that the award system is very complicated and therefore these companies make these mistakes. But one thing we have to realize is that these mistakes always result in underpayment rather than overpayment. So I wouldn't rule out ill intent in any case.
How widespread is this, what comes under the banner of wage theft, as it's called? How widespread in Australia?
It's widespread. I think PricewaterhouseCoopers put a figure of 1.35 billion each year that Australian workers get underpaid. So that's quite significant. If we listen to the industry peak bodies, they'd like to sort of make us believe it's not that big an issue. They don't like the term wage theft. They prefer the term wage non-compliance. But in the case of Coles, if I go through the self-checkout and I don't pay for all my groceries, that's not checkout non-compliance, that's theft. So I think in the cases of employers doing the same to their employees, we should call it what it is, and that is wage theft.
Is it being treated as a widespread problem, or is it being treated on a case-by-case basis?
Well, I think now with the suggestions made by the Attorney General today, I think we're finally sort of getting up to speed on addressing this issue appropriately. I think that so far we've seen these cases starting with 7-Eleven a few years ago, so it has taken the government quite some time to respond to it accurately.
Now, in this case, because the Attorney General has just flagged these changes, but Coles will pay back around $20 million to the workers affected, which is about 1% of the workforce. Is that their only penalty? Besides any reputational damage?
Yeah, well, they're likely to get a slap on the wrist in the form of a financial penalty. And the Attorney General today alluded to the fact that companies do suffer reputational damage. Some of the suggested reforms include companies having to announce publicly that they've been involved in wage theft. So there is that element to it. But obviously the question is, for a big supermarket like Coles that effectively has a duopoly with Woolworths over the market, the question is, like, are those companies not simply too big to shame? Like, they can basically take any hit because it's really hard to boycott Coles.
Do they face any class actions, be it by the workers or by shareholders, for example?
Yeah, that's a good question. We've seen the shareholder activism in this space ramp up. So I can imagine, obviously, AGM season for most companies is behind us. So perhaps later in the year, we'll see some resolutions go up at an AGM, for example. And it's quite possible that there will be some sort of class action as well that will affect Coles. Yeah.
And is the reputational damage that severe, and is it lasting?
Well, that's a good question. I think for some companies it's more severe. So let's take the restaurant business for an example. You have these businesses with very familiar faces attached to them, whether that's George Calombaris or otherwise Heston Blumenthal. So people are more familiar with that and they take a reputational hit. But Coles doesn't really have a public face. And it's similar with the banks, the big four banks. Obviously they had severe misconduct, but not a lot of people, I think, left those banks to do their banking business somewhere else. So I think reputational damage is part of it, but you can't only rely on that. I think another thing that needs to happen is basically have larger fines to act as a deterrent for companies not to underpay their workers. And
the changes flagged by the Attorney General today, if they were to eventuate, will this address the issue? I think larger fines will address the issue. More resources for the Fair Work Ombudsman to follow this type of misconduct up more directly. I think that would definitely help. And as well, criminalising the worst forms of wage theft, I think, could be sort of a real deterrent that will be needed to stop companies from doing this in the future. And what about people who work for much smaller companies than the likes of Coles? What options do they have if they believe they're being underpaid? It's really difficult for people in smaller workplaces. Most of the underpayment issues that we've seen in the media are they concern the bigger companies effectively. And if you work in a small business where you're one of few employees, it can actually be really hard to speak up because obviously a lot of people would fear to lose their job. So there's usually strength in numbers. So if you have a large workforce, such as in Coles, which is also unionized to a degree, then it's easier to speak up. But in a smaller workplace, employers have a lot more power over their employees
employees, and it's a lot harder for those people to speak up, yes.
Martijn Boersma from UTS Business School, thanks for coming in.